talk about the heroes of the Great Patriotic War. Images of Zhukov on a white horse, Rokossovsky with binoculars in his hands, and Konev leading his tanks to Berlin come to mind. But there is a name that is rarely mentioned in school textbooks, even though many of our victories would simply not have been possible without this man. Alexander Mikhailovich Vasilevsky was the man who planned Stalingrad and Bagration, coordinated the defeat of the Kwantung Army, but remained forever in the shadow of his more famous colleagues. Why did the architect of the greatest operations of the war become an invisible hero of victory? What price did he pay for his desire to work not for glory, but for results? And why is his name finally returning to our historical consciousness today? Subscribe to the channel to learn more about the forgotten heroes of history. And in the comments, write whether you think Vasilevsky deserves the same recognition as Zhukov and other famous marshals, or whether modesty and working in the shadows are the virtues of a true strategist. In the pantheon of great commanders of World War II, there are names that resound like artillery cannon fire: Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Konev. Their faces are familiar to everyone from school, their memoirs have become bestsellers, and their military genius is unquestionable. But behind the glare of their martial stars, there is an almost invisible shadow of a man without whom many of these brilliant victories might not have happened. The name of this man is Alexander Mikhailovich Vasilevsky, Chief of the General Staff, Stalin's right-hand man in strategic planning, coordinator of key fronts at decisive moments of the war. Why did he, one of the main architects of victory, remain in the background in the perception of posterity? Unlike the emotional and assertive Zhukov, Vasilevsky was the embodiment of calmness, restraint, and incredible staff culture. He was not seen on the front lines with a pistol in his hand, nor did he deliver fiery speeches to the troops. His battlefield was maps, his weapon was precise calculation, and his armies were hundreds of figures, reports, and plans, which, in the silence of the Kremlin offices, were turned into directives that decided the fate of millions. It was Vasilevsky whom Stalin trusted with the development of the most complex and risky operations. When it was necessary not just to break through the front line, but to weave a complex web of actions involving several fronts, intelligence, logistics, and reserves, it was he who took center stage. Operation Uranus near Stalingrad, the ingenious Bagration plan in Belarus, the lightning defeat of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria. Behind each of these victories was his meticulous work. He was the Grey Cardinal of the Supreme Command headquarters, a man who preferred to remain behind the scenes of the grand theater of war, leaving the glory to others. This modesty, bordering on asceticism, was not a pose, but the essence of his character. He was a man of duty, for whom the result was more important than personal fame. He coordinated the actions of the fronts commanded by Zhukov, but at the victory parade in June 1945, it was Zhukov who rode in on a white horse. This image became forever fixed in the public consciousness, leaving Vasilevsky, the architect of many victorious strategies, in the shadows. To understand this historical injustice, or perhaps inevitability, one must delve deeper into his biography, grasp the essence of his work, and understand the complex system of relationships within the Soviet military elite, where personal ambition sometimes meant as much as strategic talent. The story of his life is not a loud saga of exploits, but a quiet yet intense tale of colossal intellectual work. which became the invisible foundation of the great victory. This story has everything: ups and downs, triumphs and oblivion, but most importantly, it shows that great victories are created not only on the battlefield, but also in the quiet of offices, where plans capable of changing the course of history are born. Vasilevsky was a master of precisely this kind of invisible war of minds, where every decision could cost the lives of thousands of soldiers or bring salvation to entire armies. To understand the unique mind and character of Alexander Vasilevsky, we need to go back to his origins, which did not at all foreshadow his dizzying military career. He was born on September 28, 1895, in the village of Novaya Golchika, Kineshma district, Kostroma province, into the family of Orthodox priest Mikhail Alexandrovich Vasilevsky and his wife Nadezhda Ivanovna. This background could have become a stigma for him in the future during the years of militant atheism, but fate decided otherwise. His father saw his son as the continuation of a spiritual dynasty and sent him first to the Kineshma Theological School and then, in 1909, to the Kostroma Theological Seminary. It seemed that his life was predetermined: a cassock, a parish, serving God in the remote Russian province. However, young Alexander dreamed of something completely different. He wanted to become an agronomist or a surveyor, work on the land, and help farmers increase their yields. These dreams of creative, peaceful work say a lot about his nature. He was not born a warrior. He had no innate desire for weapons and battles. On the contrary, he was attracted to construction, creation, and systematic work to improve life. The First World War changed everything. In 1915, swept up in a wave of patriotism, like many of his peers, Vasilevsky passed his exams for the penultimate year of seminary as an external student and enrolled in the Alexeyev Military School in Moscow. After just 4 months of accelerated training, the former seminarian was already an ensign in the Russian Imperial Army. But those 4 months gave him more than just a military rank. He mastered the basics of military affairs, tactics, and regulations, and learned how to command people. At the front, he proved himself to be a brave and capable commander. He did not sit in the rear, but commanded a company of the 4th Rifle Regiment, then a battalion, rose to the rank of staff captain, and earned the respect of his soldiers with his fairness and care for his subordinates. It was there, in the trenches of World War I, that he gained his first invaluable combat experience and realized that war is not only about heroism and feats, but also about terrible, exhausting labor that requires iron discipline and mathematically precise calculations. The revolution of 1917 and the subsequent collapse of the army found him in Romania. Like many officers of the old army, he found himself at a historical crossroads. For a time, he even returned to civilian life, working as a teacher in his native Tula province, trying to find his place in the new world. But in April 1919, he was mobilized into the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. Thus began his journey in a completely new military structure, which was radically different from the old Imperial Army. During the Civil War, he rose from assistant platoon commander to regiment commander, fighting against General Denikin's troops and various White Guard units in the Smolensk province. Even then, his superiors noted not only his personal bravery, but also his exceptional organizational skills and ability to establish clear staff work, even in the conditions of complete chaos of the Civil War. After the end of the Civil War, a completely new era in Alexander Vasilevsky's military career began. Whereas before he had been a commander directly leading soldiers in battle, now his calling became staff work, that invisible but critically important activity that made him one of the greatest military strategists in history. In 1920, he entered the General Staff Academy of the Red Army, named after Kliment Voroshilov. This educational institution trained the elite of the Soviet military, and only officers who had demonstrated exceptional abilities could get in. 3 years of study at the academy became a real school of strategic thinking for Vasilevsky. He studied military history, tactics, operational art, and logistics. His teachers noted his phenomenal analytical skills, his ability to see the big picture of combat operations and find weaknesses in the enemy's plans. Even then, it was clear that they were dealing with no ordinary commander, but a man with a rare gift for strategic planning. After graduating from the academy in 1923, Vasilevsky was assigned to the headquarters of the North Caucasus Military District, followed by years of painstaking staff service in various districts. He was chief of staff of a division and a corps, and worked in the headquarters of military districts. It would seem to be routine work, far from the glory of the front lines, but it was here that his unique experience was formed. He learned to plan operations, coordinate the actions of various branches of the military, and solve the most complex logistical problems. In 1930, an event occurred that could have put an end to his career. A campaign to combat enemies of the people in the army began, and Vasilevsky's background, the son of a priest, came under suspicion. His father, already an elderly man by that time, was arrested and exiled. Alexander Mikhailovich himself came under the close scrutiny of the security services. He honestly wrote about his social background in questionnaires, but this could have been his downfall. Only one thing saved him: his impeccable service and obvious professional qualities, which were too valuable to the army. Stalin's repressions of the 1930s dealt a terrible blow to the Red Army's command structure. Thousands of experienced commanders, including marshals and generals, were shot. In these conditions, specialists such as Vasilevsky became worth their weight in gold. In 1938, he was appointed head of the Operations Directorate of the General Staff, a position that opened a direct path to the top of the military hierarchy. Here, in the quiet offices on Frunze Embankment, he mastered the highest secrets of strategic planning. He participated in the development of plans for the country's defense, studied potential adversaries, and analyzed their strengths and weaknesses. Working in the General Staff required not only military knowledge, but also a deep understanding of politics, economics, and diplomacy. It was necessary to be able to think on a large scale, to see war not as a series of separate battles, but as a complex system of interrelated processes. It was these years that turned the talented commander Vasilevsky into an outstanding strategist, capable of thinking in terms of theaters of war and global operations. On June 20, 1941, when German troops invaded the Soviet border, Alexander Vasilevsky was at the very epicenter of military command. As Deputy Chief of the General Staff's Operations Directorate, he was one of the first to receive reports of the outbreak of war. What happened in the first days and weeks of the war came as a shock of incredible force to him, as it did to the entire Soviet military leadership. All pre-war plans, calculations, and forecasts collapsed under the onslaught of the German war machine, honed in battles in Poland and France. Despite its size and armament, the Red Army was not prepared for such a blow. The first days of the war were a nightmare for any staff officer. Communication with the front lines was lost. Entire armies disappeared from the command's field of vision, and reports were fragmentary and contradictory. Vasilevsky worked almost without sleep, trying to somehow restore control of the troops and understand the scale of the disaster. His analytical mind allowed him to see the picture of what was happening more clearly than many others. He understood that the war would be long and difficult, that it would be necessary to retreat and suffer huge losses, but he also saw opportunities for resistance. Already in the first weeks of the war, Vasilevsky's qualities, which made him indispensable to Stalin, became apparent. When others were lost in chaos or proposed a panicked retreat, he kept a cool head and offered concrete solutions. His notes and reports from that period are striking for their sober analysis and accurate predictions. He was one of the first to understand that the blitzkrieg could only be stopped by a competent defense combined with counterattacks, that it was necessary to trade space for time, accumulating forces for decisive battles. In July 1941, an event occurred that dramatically changed his career. Chief of the General Staff Marshal Boris Mikhailovich Shaposhnikov fell seriously ill, and Stalin appointed Vasilevsky to replace him, albeit only as acting chief for the time being. At the age of just 46, he found himself at the head of the country's main headquarters at the most critical moment in its history. This appointment was no accident. Stalin had already assessed Vasilevsky's analytical abilities, his ability to quickly process huge amounts of information and draw the right conclusions. The new appointment meant not only a great honor, but also a tremendous responsibility. Now, it was his task to plan all major operations, coordinate the actions of the fronts, and provide the troops with everything they needed. The autumn of 1941 became a real school of military leadership in extreme conditions for Vasilevsky. The enemy was at the gates of Moscow, Leningrad was surrounded, and a significant part of the European territory of the USSR was occupied. In these conditions, every decision could be fatal. Vasilevsky proved himself a master of crisis management. He participated in planning the defense of Moscow, preparing a counteroffensive, and organizing supplies for besieged Leningrad. His ability to see the big picture and coordinate the actions of various fronts proved invaluable. By the end of 1941, it became clear that the blitzkrieg had failed, and that the Red Army, despite heavy losses, had retained its combat capability and was ready for a protracted struggle. The winter of 1940 to 1941 became a turning point, not only in the course of the war, but also in Vasilevsky's emergence as an outstanding military strategist. Moscow was hanging by a thread. German troops had approached the capital at a distance of 20 to 30 kilometers, captured Klin and Solonekhnogorsk, and reached the Moscow-Volga Canal. It seemed that the fall of the city was inevitable, and with it, the collapse of the entire system of state administration. During these critical days, Vasilevsky proved himself to be a master of operational planning. He participated in the development of a counter-offensive plan near Moscow, an operation that was intended not only to stop the enemy, but also to inflict a serious defeat on them. This was the first major offensive operation in which he was directly involved in planning, and its success largely determined his future career. The counteroffensive plan was bold and risky. It involved striking the flanks of the German forces using fresh reserves transferred from the Far East. Vasilevsky understood that the Red Army had only one chance, and that delay would be fatal. He worked on the details of the operation day and night, calculating the routes of troop movements, the amounts of ammunition needed, and the capabilities of rail transport. On December 6, 1941, the counteroffensive began near Moscow. The first few days showed that the General Staff's calculations were correct. The German troops, exhausted by the autumn battles and unprepared for winter warfare, could not withstand the powerful blow. They began to retreat, and in some places, the retreat turned into a panicked flight. Within a few weeks, the enemy was pushed back from Moscow to a distance of 100 to 200 kilometers. This victory was of colossal significance. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the Wehrmacht suffered a serious defeat, and the myth of its invincibility was dispelled. But for Vasilevsky, the victory near Moscow meant even more. It proved to Stalin his abilities as a strategist and planner of large-scale operations. From that moment on, the leader's trust in him became virtually limitless. The success of the counteroffensive near Moscow opened up new horizons for Vasilevsky. Stalin began to involve him in the planning of increasingly complex and large-scale operations. In February 1942, he was officially confirmed as Chief of the General Staff and Deputy People's Commissar of Defense. At the age of 47, he became one of the most influential people in the country's military leadership. The spring and summer of 1942 brought new challenges. The Germans, having recovered from their winter defeat, launched a new offensive in the south, seeking to capture Stalingrad and the oil fields of the Caucasus. The Red Army once again found itself in a dire situation. Vasilevsky understood that there were no easy solutions and that fundamentally new approaches to warfare had to be found. It was during this period that he began to develop the concept of large-scale strategic operations that would turn the tide of the war. He understood that local successes were not enough. Operations were needed that could destroy entire enemy groups and radically change the situation on the front. These ideas formed the basis for planning future offensive operations, including the famous Uranus near Stalingrad. By the fall of 1942, the situation on the Soviet-German front had reached a critical point. German troops had captured most of Stalingrad, reached the Volga, and were preparing for the final assault on the city. At the same time, another Wehrmacht group was pushing towards the oil fields of the Caucasus. It seemed that the USSR was on the brink of collapse, and another defeat could be fatal. It was at this moment that Vasilevsky proposed a plan that many military historians consider a masterpiece of strategic art, an operation codenamed Uranus. The idea for the operation was born in September 1942 as a result of a thorough analysis of the situation at Stalingrad. Vasilevsky noticed something that many other commanders had overlooked. The German forces in the city were extremely vulnerable. Their flanks were covered by Germany's allies, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian troops, who were inferior to the Germans in training, armament, and motivation. Moreover, these troops were stretched across a huge front and did not have sufficient reserves. Vasilevsky realized that this was where the strike should be delivered. The plan for Operation Uranus was striking in its boldness and scale. It was planned that the forces of three fronts, Southwestern, Don, and Stalingrad, would deliver powerful blows to the flanks of the German group, join forces in the enemy's rear, and encircle General Friedrich Paulus's entire Sixth Army. If the plan succeeded, about 300,000 soldiers and officers, the cream of the German army, would be trapped in the cauldron. Preparing for the operation required enormous effort and masterful planning. It was necessary to secretly concentrate enormous forces, provide them with everything they needed, and develop detailed plans of attack for each section of the front. Vasilevsky personally traveled to the front, studied the terrain, met with commanders, and checked the readiness of the troops. He understood that the slightest error in calculations could lead to the failure of the entire operation. Particular attention was paid to camouflage. The Germans were not to find out about the planned offensive. Troops were moved only at night. Radio communications were kept to a minimum, and disinformation about the alleged preparations for defense was spread. Vasilevsky understood that surprise was the main condition for the success of the operation. On November 19, 1942, at 7:30 a.m., Soviet artillery opened fire on enemy positions. Operation Uranus had begun. On the very first day, it became clear that Vasilevsky's calculations had been correct. The Romanian and Italian troops could not withstand the powerful blow and began to retreat. Soviet tank corps rushed into the gaps that had formed, seeking to reach the enemy's rear as quickly as possible. On November 23rd, a historic event took place. The advanced units of the Southwestern and Stalingrad fronts joined forces in the area of Kalach-na-Donu. The ring around the 6th Army was closed. About 290,000 enemy soldiers and officers were trapped in the cauldron. The success of Operation Uranus brought Vasilevsky well-deserved fame. Stalin appreciated the work of his chief of the general staff, and military historians later recognized this operation as one of the most brilliant in the history of military art. It showed that the Red Army had not only learned to defend itself, but could also carry out the most complex offensive operations at the highest international standards. In the history of the Great Patriotic War, there are no figures more contradictory and at the same time complementary than Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov and Alexander Mikhailovich Vasilevsky. These two outstanding commanders embodied two completely different approaches to military art, two different philosophies of command. If Zhukov was a flame, emotional, impulsive, straightforward, then Vasilevsky was ice, cold calculation, restraint, diplomacy. Their relationship was complex, at times tense, but it was their tandem that largely ensured victory in the war. Zhukov was famous for his ability to fire up his subordinates, inspiring them to feats of valor with his personal example and iron will. He was a commander who could lead soldiers into battle, breaking the enemy's resistance with his drive and determination. But there was a downside to this approach. Zhukov could be cruel to his subordinates, demand the impossible, and disregard losses. His directness and sharpness often created problems in his relationships with allies and political leaders. Vasilevsky was his complete opposite. He never raised his voice, always remained correct and polite, and was able to find compromises in the most difficult situations. His strength lay in his ability to plan, analyze, and anticipate developments several steps ahead. If Zhukov was a master of tactics and operational art, Vasilevsky was a genius of strategy. Their first serious interaction took place during the defense of Leningrad, when Zhukov commanded the front and Vasilevsky coordinated his actions from the general staff. Even then, it became clear that they complemented each other perfectly. Vasilevsky's strategic thinking and Zhukov's operational genius created a powerful combination. Their interaction was particularly evident in the planning and execution of major operations in the second half of the war. Vasilevsky developed the overall plan, calculated all possible scenarios, and Zhukov brilliantly implemented these plans, achieving victory where other commanders might have failed. However, there was also a certain rivalry between them. Zhukov, accustomed to being the center of attention, sometimes resented the role of executor of other people's plans. He strove for independence and wanted to plan operations himself. Vasilevsky, on the contrary, preferred to remain in the shadows. But that did not mean that he did not notice Zhukov's attempts to belittle his role. In his memoirs, written after the war, this hidden competition between two outstanding commanders can be read between the lines. Stalin skillfully exploited the differences in the characters of his marshals. When it was necessary to break the enemy's resistance to solve the problem at any cost, he sent Zhukov. When subtle planning, coordination of actions on several fronts, and diplomatic solutions to complex issues were required, Vasilevsky came to the fore. The leader understood that each of them was indispensable in their own field and tried to prevent open conflict between them. The differences were evident even in small things. Zhukov loved luxury, good food, and quality clothing, and did not deny himself any pleasures. Vasilevsky was almost an ascetic. He dressed modestly, was content with simple food, and devoted all his free time to work. Zhukov was sociable, loved noisy companies, and could drink and have fun. Vasilevsky preferred the silence of his office, books, and reflection. These differences in character and lifestyle only emphasized the contrast between the two great commanders. Despite all their differences and hidden rivalry, their professional interaction was flawless. They understood that the war was more important than personal ambitions and knew how to work as a team for a common goal. In the summer of 1943, the Soviet military leadership faced a dilemma that could determine the outcome of the entire war. Intelligence reported a concentration of huge German forces in the Kursk Bulge, a protrusion of the Soviet front that cut deep into German positions. Hitler was planning Operation Citadel, a massive offensive that would encircle and destroy Soviet troops in the Kursk salient, then build on that success to turn the tide of the war in Germany's favor. For the Germans, it was a last-ditch attempt to regain the strategic initiative. Stalin was inclined to launch a preemptive strike, to attack first, before the enemy had completed its preparations. Many front commanders supported this idea, but Vasilevsky proposed a fundamentally different plan, which required the Soviet leadership to have nerves of steel and absolute confidence in the correctness of their calculations. He proposed consciously accepting a defensive battle, wearing down the enemy in defense, and then launching a counter-offensive to finish off the weakened enemy. This plan was revolutionary for Soviet military doctrine, which had always relied on offense. Vasilevsky justified his position with a thorough analysis of the forces of the parties and the nature of the terrain. He understood that the Germans had concentrated their best divisions, the latest Tiger and Panther tanks, and Ferdinand assault guns for Operation Citadel. A head-on attack by such forces would be suicidal, but if they could be forced to attack pre-prepared defensive positions, it would be possible to exploit all the advantages of the defending side. Preparing for the Battle of Kursk became a test of Vasilevsky's maturity as a strategist. He personally oversaw the creation of a grandiose defense system. 8 defensive lines up to 300 kilometers deep, minefields of unprecedented density, anti-tank areas, and artillery positions. Every square kilometer of the Kursk salient was turned into a fortress. At the same time, strike groups were secretly being prepared for a counter-offensive. Vasilevsky understood that defense was only the first part of the operation. The main goal was not simply to repel the German offensive, but to seize the initiative and inflict a defeat on the enemy from which it would never recover. On July 5, 1943, German troops launched an offensive. The greatest battle in the history of the war began. Vasilevsky's calculations proved to be completely correct. German tank wedges, encountering powerful anti-tank defenses, began to suffer huge losses. The newest Tigers and Panthers were blown up by mines, burned under Soviet artillery fire, and got stuck in anti-tank ditches. In a week of fighting, the Germans advanced only a few kilometers, losing hundreds of tanks and thousands of soldiers. On July 12th, the largest tank battle in history took place, the Battle of Prokhorovka. About 1,200 tanks from both sides took part in it. The Germans tried to break through the defenses with a massive tank attack, but met with an equally powerful counterattack by Soviet troops. By the end of the day, the battlefield was littered with hundreds of burned-out vehicles, but the German offensive had finally stalled. On August 3rd, when it became clear that Operation Citadel had failed, Soviet troops launched a counter-offensive. Now it was time to implement the second part of Vasilevsky's plan. Operations Kutuzov and Commander Rumyantsev unfolded exactly as he had anticipated. Exhausted from defending their positions, the German troops were unable to withstand the powerful blows of the fresh Soviet reserves. The Battle of Kursk was a triumph of strategic defense and, at the same time, a brilliant example of the transition from defense to offense. Vasilevsky proved that a well-planned defense can be no less effective than the most daring offensive. By the summer of 1944, Alexander Vasilevsky had already established himself as a master of strategic planning. But he still had to create an operation that would surpass all previous achievements and become the benchmark for military art. This operation was codenamed Bagration in honor of the hero of the Patriotic War of 1812, Prince Pyotr Ivanovich Bagration. The plan was to liberate Belarus and deal a crushing defeat to the German Army Group Center. Planning Operation Bagration was the pinnacle of Vasilevsky's career. He had to solve many complex problems, coordinate the actions of four fronts, ensure the surprise of the attack, and correctly distribute forces across the vast area from Vitebsk to Kovel. Every detail of the plan had to be carefully thought out, because the slightest mistake could lead to the failure of the entire operation. A distinctive feature of Vasilevsky's plan was that it envisaged not just a breakthrough of the front, but the complete encirclement and destruction of the enemy's main forces. The German Army Group Center occupied advantageous defensive positions, relying on powerful fortified areas in Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk. A frontal assault on these fortresses would have resulted in enormous losses. Vasilevsky proposed to bypass these centers of resistance, encircle them, and destroy them piece by piece. The genius of the plan lay in its multi-pronged approach. The first strike was delivered on the flanks of the German group, near Vitebsk and south of Bobruisk. After breaking through the defenses, Soviet troops were to rapidly advance deep into enemy territory, not giving the enemy time to recover and organize a new line of defense. At the same time, supporting strikes would tie down German reserves, preventing them from transferring forces to threatened areas. Preparation for the operation required enormous efforts in camouflage and disinformation. The Germans had to be made to believe that the main strike would be delivered in the south, in the Ukraine region. To this end, a false concentration of troops was carried out. Disinformation was spread, and preparations for crossings over the Dnieper were simulated. Meanwhile, strike groups from four fronts were secretly concentrated in the forests of Belarus. Vasilevsky personally supervised all aspects of the operation's preparation. He traveled to the front, met with commanders, checked the readiness of the troops, and adjusted plans in accordance with changes in the situation. Particular attention was paid to the interaction of various branches of the armed forces. infantry, tanks, artillery, and aviation. Each strike had to be coordinated in terms of time and place with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. On June 23, 1944, exactly 3 years after the start of the war, Soviet troops went on the offensive. Operation Bagration began. It became clear in the first few days that Vasilevsky's plan was working flawlessly. The German defenses were breached in several places at once, and the enemy did not have time to regroup and plug the gaps. Soviet tank corps rushed into the breaches, bypassing fortified areas and destroying the enemy's rear. By the end of the first week of the operation, Army Group Center found itself in a catastrophic situation. The Vitebsk Group was surrounded and destroyed, and the Bobruisk Pocket was also eliminated. The remnants of the German troops retreated westward in disorder, abandoning their equipment and supplies. In 2 months of Operation Bagration, Soviet troops advanced 400 to 500 kilometers, liberated all of Belarus, a significant part of the Baltic states, and reached the borders of East Prussia and Poland. 28 German divisions were destroyed, and more than 100,000 soldiers and officers were taken prisoner. This defeat was a catastrophe for the Wehrmacht, surpassing even the Battle of Stalingrad in scale. Operation Bagration demonstrated Vasilevsky's supreme skill as a strategist and planner. It became a model of a modern offensive operation, combining surprise, the concentration of forces in decisive areas, deep penetration into the enemy's rear, and the complete destruction of its groups. This victory finally turned the tide of the war and opened the way to Berlin. In April 1945, when the outcome of the war in Europe was already decided and Soviet troops were storming Berlin, Alexander Vasilevsky received a top-secret assignment from Stalin. He was to lead the preparations for war with Japan, Hitler's last ally. This mission required all his accumulated knowledge and experience, as he had to plan an operation in completely different conditions, in the mountainous and desert terrain of the Far East, against an enemy with different tactics and strategies. Vasilevsky's transfer to the Far East was shrouded in such secrecy that even many high-ranking military commanders were unaware of his new appointment. Officially, he remained chief of the general staff, but in fact, he was already preparing to defeat the Kwantung Army. This double game was necessary in order not to reveal the true intentions of the USSR to the Japanese. Japan still hoped for Soviet mediation in negotiations with the Allies and did not suspect the impending attack. The task facing Vasilevsky was extremely difficult. The Kwantung Army was considered one of the best in the Japanese armed forces. It had more than 1 million soldiers and officers, was well armed, and occupied powerful defensive positions in Manchuria. Japanese generals had turned the territory into a giant fortress, using mountain ranges, rivers, and deserts as natural barriers. Moreover, they had to fight thousands of kilometers away from their main supply bases, in conditions where every kilogram of ammunition and food had to be delivered via the only Trans-Siberian Railway. Vasilevsky began with a thorough study of the theater of war. He personally traveled the entire border with Manchuria, studied maps, consulted with geologists and topographers, and met with scouts who had worked in the region for many years. He needed to understand how to cross the mountain ranges of the Greater Khingan, how to supply troops in the Gobi Desert, and how to use rivers and lakes for crossing and supply. Vasilevsky paid particular attention to studying Japanese tactics. Unlike the Germans, who preferred maneuver warfare, the Japanese relied on stubborn positional defense. They created powerful fortified areas, ready for a long siege, and hoped to wear down the enemy in protracted battles. Vasilevsky understood that such tactics required fundamentally different methods of warfare. His plan for the campaign against Japan was striking in its audacity. Instead of a frontal assault on Japanese fortifications, he proposed to deliver the main blow through the Gobi Desert and the Greater Khingan Mountains, which were considered impassable. While the Japanese were waiting for an attack from the north and east, Soviet troops were to appear in their rear, cut off their retreat routes, and force them to surrender. This plan required a tremendous amount of work to supply the troops in difficult conditions. It was necessary to create fuel and ammunition depots in the desert, build roads through mountain passes, and provide troops with water in arid areas. Vasilevsky personally supervised all these preparations, understanding that the success of the entire operation depended on the quality of the rear preparations. The transfer of troops to the Far East was carried out in the strictest secrecy. Trains ran only at night, unloading took place in remote areas, and troops immediately took cover in the forests. Japanese intelligence was not to learn of the scale of the Soviet forces' concentration. At the same time, a large-scale disinformation campaign was carried out. In the European part of the country, preparations for demobilization were simulated, and rumors about the reduction of the army were spread. By the beginning of August 1945, Vasilevsky had concentrated 1.5 million soldiers, more than 5,000 tanks, and over 26,000 guns and mortars in the Far East. This force outnumbered the Kwantung Army and was ready for decisive action. On August 9, 1945, at 1 a.m. local time, the last major operation of World War II began. Soviet troops under the command of Alexander Vasilevsky crossed the border of Manchuria and attacked the positions of the Kwantung Army. Military historians call what happened in the next 11 days one of the most brilliant operations in the history of military art. The Manchurian Strategic Offensive Operation. The strike was so sudden and powerful that the Japanese command was unable to comprehend the scale of what was happening for a long time. While Japanese generals were expecting an attack from the north and east, the main forces of the Soviet troops attacked them from the west, from the Gobi Desert, which the Japanese considered impassable. General Andrei Kravchenko's 6th Guards Tank Army made an incredible march across the Greater Khingan Range, covering more than 300 kilometers of mountain roads and trails in the first 3 days. By the end of the 3rd day, Soviet tanks appeared in the central regions of Manchuria, where they were completely unexpected. At the same time, troops of Marshal Rodion Yakovlevich Malinovsky's Transbaikal Front advanced from the west and from the east by Marshal Kirill Afanasyevich Meretskov's First Far Eastern Front, and from the north by General Maxim Alexievich Purkaev's Second Far Eastern Front. 3 powerful strikes from different directions created a hopeless situation for the Japanese. Vasilevsky coordinated the actions of all fronts from his command post, ensuring that the offensive proceeded strictly according to plan. His calculations proved accurate with mathematical precision. The Japanese defense could not withstand the simultaneous attack from 3 directions and began to collapse. The breakthrough through the Greater Khingan Range was a particularly heavy blow to the enemy. Japanese generals simply could not believe that Soviet tanks were capable of overcoming these mountains. When reports of the appearance of Soviet armored vehicles in the rear began to arrive one after another, panic broke out in the Japanese command. Reserves rushed from one sector to another, but were too late everywhere. The Soviet offensive was developing too quickly. The campaign turned into a real blitzkrieg. Soviet troops advanced at a speed of 40 to 50 kilometers per day, not allowing the enemy to gain a foothold at intermediate lines. Japanese fortified areas, which had taken years and enormous resources to build, were bypassed on the flanks and stormed from the rear. Many garrisons surrendered without putting up serious resistance. Particularly impressive was the defeat of the Mudanjiang fortified area, one of the strongest Japanese fortresses. The troops of the First Far Eastern Front stormed it for several days, applying the experience gained during the assault on German fortifications in Europe. Powerful artillery preparation and coordinated actions by the infantry, tanks, and aviation broke the defenders' resistance. On August 13th, the advanced units of the Transbaikal and First Far Eastern Fronts joined forces in the Mukden area. The main forces of the Kwantung Army were surrounded. The Japanese command realized that continued resistance was pointless. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki finally convinced Emperor Hirohito of the need to surrender. On August 15th, the emperor addressed the nation with a statement ending the war. But even after that, many Japanese units continued to resist. It took several more days to completely break their will to fight. On August 19th, General Yamada Otoshi, commander of the Kwantung Army, officially surrendered. 594,000 Japanese soldiers and officers surrendered, practically the entire Kwantung Army. The Manchurian campaign was a triumph of Vasilevsky's strategic artistry. In 11 days, a million-strong enemy force was defeated, and an area of more than 1.5 million square kilometers was liberated. Soviet losses were surprisingly low, less than 12,000 killed and wounded. The victory in the war, which brought Vasilevsky fame as one of the greatest commanders in history, unexpectedly marked the beginning of the most difficult period of his life. Stalin, who had always been suspicious of overly popular military leaders, began to gradually remove his marshals from real power. Vasilevsky did not escape this fate, despite his impeccable loyalty and modesty. The first warning signs appeared as early as 1946. Vasilevsky was unexpectedly relieved of his post as Chief of the General Staff and appointed commander of the Transcaucasian Military District, in effect, an honorary exile. Officially, this was explained by the need to strengthen the southern borders of the country. But in reality, Stalin was simply removing the overly influential marshal from the center of power. The move to Tbilisi was a heavy blow for Vasilevsky. A man accustomed to deciding the fate of continents was forced to deal with the routine matters of garrison service. Instead of planning grandiose operations, he had to conduct reviews and exercises. Instead of communicating with outstanding military leaders, he had to deal with local party officials. For a man of his stature, it was pure torture. But Vasilevsky did not complain. He understood Stalin's logic and did not try to protest. On the contrary, with his characteristic conscientiousness, he took on his new job, striving to be as useful as possible. He studied the peculiarities of the Caucasian theater of war, developed plans for the defense of the southern borders, and engaged in combat training of troops. In 1948, an event occurred that nearly cost him his life. The so-called doctor's case began. A fabricated accusation against a group of doctors, mainly Jews, of conspiring against the Soviet leadership. As part of this case, many well-known doctors were arrested, including those who treated senior military commanders. Vasilevsky came under suspicion as one of the patients of the enemies of the people. He was summoned to Moscow for questioning and demanded to testify against the arrested doctors. It was a time when every day could be your last. Many military leaders had already disappeared in the Lubyanka torture chambers, and Vasilevsky's fate hung in the balance. Only one thing saved him: Stalin's sudden death on March 5, 1953. With the beginning of the thaw, Vasilevsky's situation began to gradually improve. The new leadership, headed by Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, needed the support of authoritative military leaders, and Vasilevsky was one of them. In 1954, he was appointed Deputy Minister of Defense, and in 1957, Minister of Defense of the USSR. However, his return to power was overshadowed by serious disagreements with the new leadership. Khrushchev carried out radical reforms in the army, reducing the number of troops and focusing on nuclear weapons. Vasilevsky, who was raised on the traditions of classical military art, considered many of these reforms to be misguided and dangerous. He believed that conventional weapons should not be abandoned in favor of nuclear ones, and that the army should be prepared for any type of conflict. These disagreements led to a new conflict. In 1957, after the events in Hungary, Vasilevsky criticized Khrushchev's military policy. The reaction was swift and harsh. In 1958, he was dismissed from his post as Minister of Defense and effectively forced into retirement. This time, it was final. Vasilevsky spent the last years of his life in relative obscurity. He worked on his memoirs, met with historians, and occasionally gave lectures. His vast experience and knowledge were hardly in demand by the state. The man who had planned the greatest operations in the history of warfare lived out his days in the shadows, watching as a new generation of military leaders attempted to solve the problems he had faced decades earlier. After his forced retirement, Alexander Vasilevsky faced a problem that torments many great people: how to pass on his invaluable experience to future generations, how to explain the decisions he made, how to protect his reputation from distortions and speculation. He decided to write his memoirs, a book that was to be not just a collection of memories, but a textbook on the art of strategy for future generations of military leaders. Work on the book, the work of a lifetime, took several years and became a kind of confession for Vasilevsky. He understood that this might be his last chance to tell the truth about the war, about the decisions he had made, and about the people he had worked with. Every page was difficult for him. He had to balance between the desire to tell the truth and an understanding of political realities, between personal memories and the demands of official history. In his memoirs, Vasilevsky appeared as he was in life: an honest, principled, modest man who always put the interests of the cause above his personal ambitions. He did not hide his mistakes and failures, did not embellish his role, did not try to belittle the merits of other military leaders. On the contrary, he generously shared the glory with his comrades in arms, emphasized the collective nature of victories, and analyzed the reasons for defeats. The pages devoted to his relationship with Stalin are particularly interesting. Vasilevsky did not idealize the leader, but he did not demonize him either. He portrayed Stalin as a complex, contradictory personality. On the one hand, a cruel dictator. On the other, a man capable of making the right strategic decisions and skilled at choosing talented executors. Vasilevsky wrote honestly about how difficult it was to work under constant pressure and suspicion, but acknowledged that it was Stalin who gave him the opportunity to realize his talent. Vasilevsky wrote just as candidly about his relationships with other marshals. He did not hide his disagreements with Zhukov, but emphasized his outstanding qualities as a commander. He spoke warmly of Rokossovsky, respectfully of Konev, and honestly analyzed the strengths and weaknesses of other military leaders. These characteristics became an invaluable source for historians as they provided an inside view of the Soviet military elite. Reflections on the nature of military art occupied a special place in the memoirs. Vasilevsky attempted to formulate the principles that guided him in planning operations. He wrote about the importance of a comprehensive analysis of the situation, about the need to take into account not only military, but also political and economic factors. He emphasized the role of intelligence, the importance of interaction between different branches of the armed forces, and the significance of the moral and psychological factor. These reflections constituted a veritable encyclopedia of strategic thinking. Vasilevsky did not limit himself to describing his own experience. He analyzed operations in which he did not personally participate, dissected the mistakes of the Soviet command, and proposed alternative solutions. His strategic vision allowed him to see the war in all its complexity and multifaceted nature, to understand the logic behind the decisions made, and to evaluate them from today's perspective. For Vasilevsky, working on his memoirs was not only a creative process, but also a way of summing up his life. He understood that his time was running out, that new generations of military leaders would face completely different challenges. Nuclear weapons had changed the nature of war. New types of weapons had appeared, and methods of warfare had changed. But the basic principles of strategic art remained unchanged, and it was these that Vasilevsky sought to pass on to posterity. The book, the work of a lifetime, became not only a memoir, but also the legacy of a great commander. In it, he tried to explain to future generations that war is not a game, that every decision costs human lives, and that the main task of a military leader is not personal glory, but service to the fatherland. These simple truths, set forth with the wisdom of a man who had gone through the crucible of the greatest war in human history, became his main legacy. The death of Alexander Vasilevsky on September 30th, 1977, went relatively unnoticed by the general public. Obituaries called him an outstanding Soviet military leader and noted his achievements during the war. But the true scale of his contribution to the victory remained hidden behind the figures of more famous marshals. It took decades for historical justice to begin to be restored, and Vasilevsky's name took its rightful place in the pantheon of the greatest commanders. The first attempts to objectively assess Vasilevsky's role in the war began during the thaw period. Military historians gained access to previously classified documents and were able to trace his participation in the planning of the war's largest operations. It turned out that virtually no significant operation in the second half of the war took place without his involvement. Uranus, Saturn, Ring, Bagration, the Manchurian operation, his analytical mind, his ability to see the big picture and find optimal solutions were evident everywhere. It gradually became clear that Vasilevsky's role was much more significant than his contemporaries had imagined. If Zhukov was a brilliant executor, capable of implementing any plan, even the most complex ones, then Vasilevsky was the architect of victories, the one who created these plans. His genius was not in personal bravery or the ability to inspire soldiers, but in his ability to think strategically, to see war as a complex system of interrelated processes. His contribution to the development of the theory and practice of strategic planning proved to be particularly important. Before the war, Soviet military doctrine relied on counterattacks and deep tank breakthroughs. Vasilevsky showed that in modern warfare, Success depends not only on the heroism of soldiers and the quality of equipment, but also on the ability to plan operations correctly, coordinate the actions of different fronts, and provide troops with everything they need. His operations became models of military art, studied in military academies around the world. Foreign military experts were among the first to appreciate the true scale of Vasilevsky's talent. Analyzing the course of World War II, they noted that the most successful Soviet operations were distinguished by an exceptionally high level of planning and coordination. The Stalingrad operation, Bagration, and the Manchurian campaign all showed signs of a unified strategic approach. When Vasilevsky's true role in planning these operations became known, Western historians began to talk about him as one of the greatest strategists of the 20th century. The rethinking of Vasilevsky's role accelerated after the collapse of the USSR, when new documents and evidence came to light. Memoirs of war participants, declassified archives, and records of negotiations all made it possible to reconstruct the true picture of how key decisions were made. It turned out that Vasilevsky was not just an executor of Stalin's will, but a full-fledged co-author of the strategy for victory. It was he who proposed the concept of strategic encirclement operations. It was he who insisted on the need for careful preparation of each operation. And it was he who coordinated the actions of the fronts at decisive moments of the war. Contemporary Russian historians call Vasilevsky the brain of the Soviet High Command, emphasizing his role in developing the overall strategy for waging war. His ability to analyze vast amounts of information, see the enemy's weaknesses, and find unexpected solutions made him indispensable to the country's military leadership. Without his participation, many operations could have unfolded quite differently, and the war could have dragged on for years. Vasilevsky's contribution to the victory over Japan is particularly highly valued. Military experts consider the Manchurian operation a masterpiece of strategic art, an operation that demonstrated the highest achievements of Soviet military thought. The fact that the million-strong Kwantung Army was defeated in 11 days with minimal losses speaks to the genius of the plan and the flawless execution. Today, Vasilevsky's name stands alongside those of the greatest commanders in human history. He is compared to Alexander the Great, Hannibal, and Napoleon, people who changed the art of war and left an indelible mark on history. But unlike many of them, Vasilevsky was not a conqueror, but a liberator, a man who used his talent not to enslave peoples, but to defend his homeland. In the history of every great victory, there are heroes in the spotlight and heroes in the shadows. Alexander Vasilevsky belonged to the second category, those people whose work determines the outcome of events but remains invisible to their contemporaries. His legacy is not monuments and parades, loud speeches and solemn awards, but something more fundamental and lasting. It is a system of strategic thinking, principles of military planning, and a culture of staff work, which he created and passed on to future generations of military leaders. The main lesson left by Vasilevsky is the understanding that modern warfare is, above all, an intellectual struggle. Victory goes not to the strongest, but to those who plan smarter, analyze better, and calculate more accurately. In an era when the art of warfare is becoming increasingly complex and technological, this principle is particularly relevant. Each of Vasilevsky's operations was a master class in strategic planning, a demonstration of how to win not by numbers, but by skill. His approach to planning operations became a classic model for military academies around the world. Thorough analysis of the enemy, study of the terrain, calculation of forces and resources, coordination of the actions of various branches of the military, ensuring surprise. Vasilevsky perfected all these elements. His operations are studied not only as historical events, but also as educational examples of correct strategic thinking. His contribution to the theory and practice of coordinating large military groups is particularly important. Before Vasilevsky, coordination between fronts was often formal in nature. Each commander acted independently, with little coordination of plans with neighbors. Vasilevsky created a system in which several fronts acted as a single mechanism, complementing and reinforcing each other. This system proved so effective that its principles are still used in military planning today. An equally important legacy of Vasilevsky was the culture of analytical work that he introduced to the Soviet General Staff. He demanded from his subordinates not just the execution of orders, but a deep understanding of the tasks at hand, a creative approach to problem-solving, and a willingness to take responsibility for the decisions made. This culture shaped a whole generation of highly qualified staff officers who continued his traditions in the post-war years. Vasilevsky also left an important moral legacy. At a time when many military leaders were fighting for personal glory and influence, he set an example of selfless service to the fatherland. His willingness to work in the shadows, give credit to others, and subordinate his personal ambitions to the common cause became a model for many officers. This example is especially important today, when military service is often seen as a means of career advancement rather than a calling. Vasilevsky's influence on the development of military art extends far beyond World War II. His principles of strategic planning have been applied in local conflicts of the post-war period, in peacekeeping operations, and in the fight against international terrorism. Modern military leaders, planning operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, often use methods first applied by Vasilevsky 70 years ago. In the age of information technology and high-precision weapons, the relevance of Vasilevsky's legacy is only increasing. Modern warfare requires even more careful planning, even more precise coordination, and even deeper analysis. The principles he laid down remain the foundation of 21st century military art. Perhaps Vasilevsky's most important lesson is the understanding that true greatness lies not in loud glory, but in the results of one's actions. He showed that it is possible to change the course of history while remaining in the shadows, that true professionalism does not need self-promotion. In a world where fame is often confused with significance, this lesson is particularly important. Vasilevsky's name may be less known to the general public than those of other Soviet marshals, but his influence on military art was more profound and lasting. He did not just win a few battles. He changed the very understanding of how modern military operations should be planned and conducted. His invisible legacy continues to live and evolve, influencing the decisions of military leaders and determining the fate of nations. This is the true immortality of a great strategist.